Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's APQC webinar on the 6 data challenges inhibiting excellence and agility in finance. My name is Megan McCulloch, Research Analyst here at APQC for the Financial Management Research Function Area. Today, we will be hosting Dan French, who is the founder and CEO of Consider Solutions. Consider Solutions provides thought leadership, process analytics, technology integration, and best practices on the journey to world class. Dan has a background of 25 years in strategy, operations, general management, consulting, performance improvement, risk management compliance, process change, and technology in global businesses. Some of you may already know, but Dan has been a guest on the APQC podcast series, so please take a listen to those when you get a chance, including today's topic around data management. So today, Dan will share some insights structured around the 6 critical data challenges that people face in the finance function, and will give the audience, you, practical ideas to assess and address what is holding back the organization's journey to finance excellence and agility. So welcome, Dan. Glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Megan. Pleased to be here. Thanks very much indeed. So this is what I'm going to talk through. So thanks for your time this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. So Megan's going to introduce me and what we're trying to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data question, and then these 6 data challenges that inhibit finance, and then how we might go about cracking those issues and some thoughts for the road, and then we'll have a Q&A. So you can ask questions as you go through, as you've, and we'll ask questions at the end, deal with questions at the end also. So that's what we're going to talk through. And I mean, here's a statement from Len DeCandia at Johnson & Johnson, and it's kind of a very simple statement, and we hear this all the time. But, you know, and he says it really well. He says, it might sound obvious, but it is worth stopping to think about. You know, if you had visibility to every transaction across the business everywhere in the world we do business, what decisions might you make differently? Now, and that really is the essence of this thing called data-driven decision-making. And we're all very aware that in our organizations, whether it's management consultants or executive advisors or whatever, everyone is telling our leadership that data is a new oil and we're all data-driven and all this good stuff. But the reality is it's a little bit harder in practice, like a lot of things. And so we have to manage this high expectation with the realities of some of these things aren't quite as easy as led to believe. So I'm going to try and talk, or I will talk, I'll try and limit it to 40 minutes of discussion, and then we'll get to the Q&A. But I think that's an interesting start point, this whole idea of what do we mean by data-driven decision-making? If I had immediate access to every slice of all of our business activities everywhere in the world, and I could slice it anyway and answer any question, that'd be amazing, right? And we all know, you know, it does sound great. But we're also faced with this interesting situation that if you're anything like me, every organization now is in love with KPIs. We've got KPI overload. We've got dashboards coming out left, right, and center. And this is a little bit of lighthearted stuff, but you know, it's not that lighthearted because everyone I know has got more KPIs than they fully understand because they're asked to have all these KPIs. They sometimes conflict. Sometimes I'm not really sure what outcome they're driving for. And I would challenge you to say, if the KPIs that you have for your organization, you know, I challenge you to just look at them and say, do they all really make sense in terms of driving the right outcomes? And I would argue that there's a little bit of a love affair with KPIs. You've got to have some, so we have them. But it's not always, again, it's another one of those things that ain't quite as obvious as it seems. Now, obviously, performance is a good thing, and telling ourselves how well we're doing is a good thing, clearly. But again, you know, there's the devil's in the detail. So I like this little cartoon because it brings a wry smile, and I'm sure you've experienced that yourself. Now, one of the reasons that data is a big issue, I mean, it's always been a big topic, but it gets bigger by the month, by the year. And it's kind of related to this whole kind of digital transformation thing. So we are led to believe, more importantly, our executives are led to believe that we're going to do this digital transformation. We're going to have new platforms, have digitally integrated processes. And as a byproduct of that, we're going to have all this data, and we're going to be able to make decisions on anything and everything. But the flip side of that is also, everybody tells us, the analysts and the statisticians tell us that 70% of those initiatives of digital transformation don't really deliver the value that were projected. And that's not to say they fail, because that's a big pejorative statement, but they don't deliver quite what was expected, either in terms of the outcome or certainly the timescale to deliver the outcome. And certainly I talked to a lot of organizations who expected big things within 18 months and actually realize after a while it's 3 or 4 years or 5 years before even a percentage of those things start to deliver. So, this is kind of related. The whole thing about digital transformation data are heavily interconnected, because I think you'll find, certainly my experience has been, the business case for digital transformation is a lot about data. So that's good news, right? So we used to say that business is about people, process, and technology. And now, thanks to folks like Gartner and others, we realize that data is at least as important as those 3 things. So we've got 4 things to worry about. And one of the reasons why digital transformations don't deliver what's expected as much as expected, as quickly as expected, is partly because this lack of understanding about the data piece, and it doesn't just come for free. You got to think about it. And I think this is really the essence of what we're discussing today. So, that's worth, it's worth thinking about. But the whole process issue, we've got data about processes supported by people, enabled by technology. And when we talk about data-driven decision-making, which I think is the term we should use rather than analytics or anything else, it's about how do we make decisions based on real data. It's about processes, because you don't make random decisions across the whole of the business. So we make business decisions about the revenue cycle. We make decisions about the cost base. We make decisions about inventory. These are important decisions, but they're process specific. And in every organization I know, every global organization, people are talking about, data-driven decision making. We want that, we aspire to it, but it's hard to do it. And part of it is because, and particularly in finance, we don't control everything. All of the data and the processes that happen, most of the processes happen outside our control. We're trying to interpret the results of all that and interpret the progress of all that. And there's this thing about control versus influence, and a lot of kind of management thinking was based on the fact you can control everything. And the reality is you can't control everything, you can only influence it. So we're dealing with stuff we can't control. So that's the first thing. That's a big that's one of the challenges. And then if you can't control it and you want to influence some kind of common view, because if you want to make decisions across the organization, you've got to have a common benchmark, you have a common basis. And that requires some cross-functional coalition of executives across the business to drive change. And building that is hard, because everyone's got their own view of performance and all the rest of it. And then there's this big problem. We talked about transformation. Obviously, every business process, every part of our business is trying to drive, ongoing, quick win performance improvement, continuous improvement. And they're also looking at the bigger picture. How do we transform to a substantially better way? And that's what some people call the design versus operate, or as is being the operate and to be being the design. And then you got this issue about we're driving change in processes, and are we actually driving change because we're trying to change the process, or are we trying to implement some technology that will be the catalyst? And that has a whole bunch of issues as well, and I'm sure you know that and you've experienced it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the other piece is human behavior has a massive impact on process execution and process change. And the irony is, and one of the things that I've noticed is, the more we digitize, the more we're at the whim of human behavior than we were before. Now that sounds counterintuitive, I know, but it's true. So, and all I say is the evidence is there. If you, maybe when we were less digitized, there was more control on what people did, the activities, and so people were controlled at a more detailed level. Now organizations expect the technology to control it, but of course it doesn't. So people are much more able to behave, to do things or work processes the way they want to. And if you're not sure, you believe me, have a look at any one of your process cycles and look at the deviations from the norm, deviations from policy and control across units across the world, operating units across the world. You'll see massive changes, massive differences, and they're all using the same systems, maybe. But if they are using the same systems, you'll still see massive differences. And if it's not a systemic change, then it's behavioral change. So that is another thing that I find quite Again, fascinating and counterintuitive. So on the data thing, everyone's been set these massively high expectations, and we see these promotions for all your data, you get insights in seconds, and it's wonderful. And you can see some amazing things. So the successes are all there. You can see, who in Europe drinks more alcohol than other people, and that's kind of a bit of a surprise maybe to some of you. You can see that little sort of spiral graph at the bottom in the middle is about the is COVID infections in North America and how they spiked up. The top right is about dietary trends across Europe, and the bottom right is about the best-selling music artists in the past 60 years, which actually is quite a surprise when you look at the detail. But all those things are fascinating, and it is wonderful. We couldn't do this a few years ago. So these data successes, this visualization, this information is beautiful mantra is really, making our executives think this is great, want more of this. So we have cracked, if you look at those examples before, that's about correlating pretty simple data items, maybe a lot of them, maybe a volume of them, but it's correlating fairly simply and visualizing them. And we've cracked that problem. There's no doubt at all that we cracked that problem. But the challenge with that is it's kind of raised expectations slightly beyond our ability to execute. So I'll give you an example. So all of those examples I gave were really visualization examples on the left-hand side on this chart. But really, when you're talking about data-driven decision-making in business, you're not just asking for a little bit of inspiration, like what does this make you think of? So you look at those charts we had, they inspire you to ask questions like, why do people in Norway eat more vegetables than people in Spain? Whatever that correlation is. But it stimulates you, inspires you, but it doesn't necessarily answer any questions. The idea of driving, and certainly in finance, we're asked for insights that can answer questions. And those insights are about the financial processes and the financial trends. And there's a difference between visualization and these process insights. And I think it's kind of important because this is what the first part where the wheels come off the bus, because our executives go, it's great, look at all this wonderful stuff we've seen. Our people can put out these great visualizations. Can you give me some really good assessments of, our revenue trends around the world? Now, at one level, for the simple correlations, we can do that. But if we're trying to look at the real nuances of business, relative to economy size, relative to market growth, all those things that make life a bit more complicated, it gets a lot harder. So I'll leave you to think about that while I ask you a question. So what's your personal involvement with data and analytics? And this will hopefully be helpful to you all. So are you one, and you might be more than one of these, you probably one of them, but you might possibly be three of them, but unlikely to be more than three. So are you a key stakeholder? You're driving improvement in data-driven decision-making for the organization. So you're trying to make that happen. Are you two, on the demand side, you need data for decision-making and you need it daily. And you're a key customer, if you like, for data-driven decision-making. Three, are you on the demand side, but you're kind of more periodic, maybe weekly, monthly, I need some key decisions. And then 4 and 5 about the supply side. Are you on the side where you're delivering business on number 4? Are you a subject matter expert, a business subject matter expert to help the supply of data analytics for your business? And 5, are you a technology subject matter expert for the supply of data analytics? And 6, are you some other something that doesn't fit into those characteristics? So 1 is you're a key stakeholder trying to drive change. 2 and 3 about you're on the demand side, you need the data-driven decision-making. And 4 and 5 is you're on the supply side, you're enabling the data-driven decision-making. How would you characterize your primary role? And as I say, it's probably 1, it might be 2, there's a chance it's 3. But try not to answer them all because I think that would get us very confused. So let's have a look and see what we come up with there. So if you want to answer your question, hopefully it makes sense. So, okay, so 40%-ish are stakeholders and driving, our stakeholders and driving change are pretty much largely equal between demand side business subject matter experts and supply business subject matter experts. In fact, if you add the daily, the periodic and the daily, that's pretty substantial group. And some of you, 17% are the IT subject matter experts, and 7% of you are glad you're not doing any of it. So that's good. Okay, thank you so much. That's that helps you also see what the community you're into here. All right, thank you. Let's move on. So I've got one more poll for you. If you take what I said about data-driven decision making, and it's a kind of philosophy almost about making decisions based on data, that's surfaced from all of our technology and databases and systems. How widely is data-driven decision making embraced in your organization? And I'd like you to choose one here. So one is, it's not a big focus today. Maybe people don't fully identify with it. Two is, it's kind of locally siloed. There's some focus, there's some embracing of the data-driven decision making there. Three, it's certain business units are doing well and they're very specifically driving it forward. Four is, we've got an enterprise-wide approach to this. And five, none of the above. Maybe because the organization isn't of the scale to even consider any of these. So have a think about that. And that's kind of, it's a little bit philosophical. It's how do your management across the organization, from the CFO down across the business, how do they view data-driven decision making? Is it something, as you say, number four, it's enterprise-wide. It's a critical enterprise-wide requirement for us to be able to make those decisions, through to business unit specific, siloed. Let's have a look at the answer, see what you say. So that's interesting. So the biggest single, so nearly half of you are business unit specific approaches. Now that makes a lot of sense. It also adds to what I'm going to talk about. It creates some challenges when you've got business units and you're looking in finance. We're trying to look at the business by business unit, by market, by customer, by geography. We're also trying to look at revenue trends and profitability trends. And if different business units have different approaches, you start to get into some interesting questions about what the aggregated view really is. Okay, let's move on. So that's a couple of polls to get you keep you focused. So I'm going to talk now about what, in my experience, the 6 data challenges are. And this is kind of, I think it's a pretty key topic, and some of these are not always well understood. So I'm going to talk about these. I'm not going to go into it now. I'm going to come to each one as we go through all 6 of them, but you can see where I'm getting at. So the first one, and I kind of touched on this already. So the first challenge is expectations, particularly of executives. We've seen the wonderful visualizations available. We've got all this received wisdom. We can do this stuff. It's kind of, can you just get it done? And there's a great piece of psychological research done by a couple of folks called Dunning and Kruger about 20 years ago. And it's really, really interesting. And when I first saw this, it made me laugh. And then I realized it should make me cry. But anyway, so I used to look at this about sort of almost like a wry smile about some of the organizations I work for, and the leaders ask us to do things that the leaders didn't really understand, but they thought it was a good idea because a management consultant had told them, and really wasn't a very good idea at all. So what this research tells you, what Dunning-Kruger effect tells you, is intelligent people on the left-hand side with very little to zero knowledge of a particular topic have a very high degree of confidence in their opinions, decisions, and judgments associated with that topic because they're smart people. Very high degree. And if any of us have the misfortune, which we all have to dig into executing on that decision or opinion, you realize as you go through it, as you get more experience, this is really complicated. It's painful, it's hard, it's nowhere near what we were led to believe. And you almost want to give up and throw yourself off the roof. Now, if you have the good fortune to become a subject matter expert on the right-hand side, you do get a much higher level of confidence, but it's interesting, you never have the level of confidence you had as a naive optimist. And that's really interesting, right? So the experts, the real experts, are not as confident as the people who are naive optimists. Now that tells you a lot about everything, but it tells you a lot about data. And it's really, really important. So you can think about how you might want to deal with that, but it's a critical piece. We are led, a lot by expectations. This stuff is easy. I've read about it. I've seen the McKinsey report. I've seen this, I've seen that. Let's just get it done. And we just have to have the courage to say, you know what, it ain't quite as simple as that. So that's part of that. The other part of expectations and received wisdom is there is somehow this belief that's developed over the past 10 or 15 years that if we get all the data in our organization cleansed and harmonized, then us finance and the business folk can ask all and any questions we want and we'll all be very happy. And you've got all the data and the applications and you get insights and you can take action. So that's data-driven decision making, right? Yeah, well, maybe, but it ain't that simple. So that idea is already being debunked quite a lot. It's just far more complicated than that. And the reality is that when you get to these issues and these questions about expectations and received wisdom, quite often the answers about data, particularly about data in finance, the simple answers are just plain wrong. They are wrong. And the real answers, the right answers are complicated and they're on the right-hand side. It's a road less traveled. And, you know, the big line of people on the left, you know, they just believe in what they're being told. So, you know, this sadly goes for a lot of things, but I think it's kind of worth thinking about. So give an example. So that's kind of expectations. I mean, and it relates to this second challenge, which is about process knowledge. To be able to answer process questions from data, we need to have deep process knowledge. Now, whether the process knowledge is about the cost side of the business, the expenditure, so this is a source to pay end-to-end process, and those are the elements of the end-to-end value chain and all the stakeholders involved. If we want to understand the dynamics of how money gets spent and whether we get value for it and how we can tune it, we've got to understand the dynamics of that process. That is a lot to understand. It's deep and complicated. And this is another example of that road less traveled. The simple answers are not necessarily right. So this is complicated, but the same is on the revenue cycle. So this is a revenue picture of the revenue cycle. If you want to understand the nuances of revenue and what revenue trends mean and what impacts revenue going up and down, what impacts revenue by market, by segment, by geography, we've got to really understand the whole piece, the whole end-to-end cycle. And of course, in finance, we've also got the whole record to report cycle. You know, how do we close the account so we can report effectively and in a controlled way to our shareholders and markets? And to understand that, you've got to understand what goes on in this process. You've got to understand what's actually happening. And of course, it's not even that. There's also this idea of, you know, even in a big global company, the intercompany process is a really big thing. Quite often, you know, 50, 60% of the financial transactions in our businesses are intercompany within the organization between geographic or industry units around the world. So the point about this is you've got to understand the process. If you want to be able to make data work for you, you've got to be able to understand the process. So to be able to understand the process, you've got to understand how we go through the process, these kind of journeys through the process. And I'm not going to go into this in detail other than this is a useful chart to use. But the key point I want to make is for any one of those processes, whether it's the revenue cycle, the expense cycle, intercompany, record to report, there isn't one journey. Even the best process has a number of journeys through it. Now, why does that matter for data? Well, it matters for data because for every one of those journeys, there are nuances about what the data means. And it's really, really important to understand the nuances because otherwise we end up making false judgments based on raw data. So we've got to understand the process to understand the data because the process and the journey through it tell us about the life cycle of data and what, for example, an invoice means at the point of view, at the point it's kind of first thought of, through the point it's closed and settled and reconciled. So when we talk about business process knowledge, the other part of the challenge is when you talk to people about the business process, you ask them, our revenue cycle, right? So our revenue cycle in the company, and maybe we've got different lines of business, but let's say for one of the revenue cycles, what does good look like? What is a good revenue cycle for us? And everyone goes, oh, that's obvious, right? Well, you know, it ain't, because like all these things, it's a combination of balancing revenue with customer satisfaction, with the ability to supply, with the ability to operate and service whatever it is you're selling. It's a much more complicated thing. It's not just about let's have more revenue. It's just not that simple. So if we're going to provide the kind of guidance we need to leadership and the data-driven decision making we're talking about, we've got to really understand these questions, and it gets complicated. A little picture on the bottom right there is this idea that when you look at revenue cycle, these two lighthouses tell you that for any process, there are multiple views of what good looks like. And it's, if you're going to try and make data tell a story that's meaningful, you've got to understand how to harmonize those views. So for example, the sales and marketing folks might have a different view of what good looks like in a revenue cycle to the finance folks, because quite often sales and marketing folk don't care about the cost of revenue, whereas finance folks sometimes do. So it's this idea of everyone goes, oh yeah, kind of, it's obvious, but it's not always obvious. And all this is critical in interpreting information and using data, right? Otherwise, we end up giving sort of spurious information. I don't know how many times you have been involved. Certainly I've been involved more times than I like to care to think about. Been in meetings in a global business where people come with their, they've kind of extracted some data into an Excel spreadsheet, they've done their modeling, they go to the meeting or the workshop, and you suddenly find that half of the meeting or workshop is really trying to work out why the data looks different for everybody. And it's because everyone's taken a slightly different slice from their own little view of their lighthouse. So again, that's a challenge too. And just an aside about that is what good looks like is really key. And quite often you're asked to give some data insights on KPIs, which we touched on earlier. And one thing I tell you is if you don't know what good looks like, avoid KPIs like the plague, because it will kill you. Because what good looks like is the most important thing, and it's the hardest question to answer. And it takes a long time. So you have to have the courage to say to the stakeholder or the process owner or the person that owns that line or that business subject matter expert, what really looks good in our revenue cycle for this product line. And don't just be fobbed off with the first response, because it's a complicated answer. And that helps us work out what you might want to be reporting on. If you start reporting on KPIs without understanding what good looks like, eventually people will blame you and your data. And it isn't you or your data, it's just that the organization isn't clear. So we need to know what good looks like. We need to understand the end-to-end process. We need to understand those journeys through it. We need to understand all the universe of data that comes from the various systems. We need to recognize that this triangle of people, process, data, and technology. And we need to actually understand the data itself, which is another problem, which we've hardly touched. So the third challenge is, which touches on KPIs as well, is people tell us, how are we doing? Give us a performance on revenue, give us performance on cost, give us performance by business unit, give us performance on how this process is working. Now, I don't know if you've heard this phrase, the watermelon KPI, but I have a number of executives who tell me that why is it all our KPI readouts are green, but our customers are unhappy, our suppliers are unhappy, our people are unhappy, and we're not shipping a lot of product? That doesn't make sense to me. It's like, well, yeah, that's the old classic watermelon. Everyone's sort of fixated on measures that make it look good, but the reality is very red. So the idea of 83%, and I'm using that as an example, the high percentage of how good we are is a largely meaningless measure. And if you're asked to present data or get data about how good we're doing, so our lagging performance measure, they're largely meaningless to start with. They can get meaningful later on. There's a lot of unintended consequences about this for the examples I've already read. A number of, I'm sure this happens in your own businesses. You've got all these KPIs, people are reporting, everything's green, but everyone's saying this isn't working. Yeah, we've got a mess, cash flows in a mess. We're not selling as much as we should be, as we planned, but everything's green. How does that make sense? So the focus is, if you want to use data to drive continuous improvement, you want to focus on defects. And this is kind of a lean Six Sigma thinking idea, but forget about the outcome. Focus on what goes wrong in a process or what can go wrong, and focus your data on that, because that is a far more insightful way of looking at what can be improved and how to get better. And I use the analogy of elite athletes. If you listen or watch any coaches of elite athletes or elite athletic teams on TV, they never talk about how well the outcome was, how fast the race was run, or how fast they're going to run it next time, or how many goals they're going to score. they talk about the process and about how to eliminate defects and variability. And, you know, we've got a lot to learn in business, because that is the truth. Defects are fuel for continuous improvement. If you start with how we get better, then you can start worrying about how good we are. If you start with how good we are, people get blurred to the idea of, oh, great, we're 83% good. That's great, isn't it? Well, it's not. So this is a lagging leading indicators discussion. I'm sure you've had this before. Yeah, so lagging indicators, they're like they're like fast food. They fill you up, they make you feel good short term, but they don't really help. The leading indicators, the things that drive performance, are the things that matter. So you've got to focus the data on those. Now, this requires us, obviously, to be able to interpret what we're being asked for and make some judgments, because often you're asked, tell me just how well we're doing revenue per whatever, or cost per or cycle time. But it's up to us to find a smarter way of answering the question. So this is the idea of performance versus defects. This analogy is pretty obvious, but it's you're driving a car. You know, you've got performance measures on the dashboard, which are kind of vaguely useful, but frankly aren't that useful when you think about it. The tachometer and the speedometer. But you've got indicators that tell you if you've got potential problems. You've got things you can do to take out or diagnose the computer on board your car, and worst case, we can actually fix things. But even with all of that, we've got the choice, the human choice of what route we take. So the whole point about this is just focus on the defects as well as the outcome. I can get there in 2 hours, but there's some impact to that. Fourth challenge is about hidden meaning in data. So we know data is central decision making. We talked about this, but we also know, and this is no surprise, and that's why we're having the conversation today, really not a lot of operational data is used today in driving decision making. And why is that? It's because it's a challenge. Now, here's a recent poll we did on LinkedIn, and really the purpose of sharing this is just say the kind of confusion really about what it is that challenges us. The availability of the data. Is it the senior management sponsorship? Is it understanding the business data? And is it the decision behavior? What is the problem? And I'd like to share this with you, because I think this is probably one of the most important mental models to think about. If you say, consider you're asking me to give you some data on a business topic, a finance topic. If you said to me, how many countries are there in the world? I'd say, I don't know, but I can Google it. I'd be very confident. I can Google it and give you an answer. Don't worry about it. I'll be back to you in 10 minutes. Well, it turns out I can't do it. Well, I can, but the answer doesn't help. There's 6 equally valid answers to that question. And then I look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. Then I have to come back to you and say, so what did you really mean? What do you really mean? What do you want to use that information for? Now, I probably sense a few wry smiles, because this happens all the time. Somebody says, can you give us the revenue by product line, or can you give us the what's the invoice status, or what's our day sales outstanding? Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And then you come back and say, what did you actually mean? Do you mean, when you said you were talking about orders, do you mean orders this year? Do you mean orders this quarter? Do you mean currently open orders? Orders we have not yet fulfilled, or the ones we have fulfilled? What do you actually, what's the detail you're asking? And we're often use sort of shorthand or code almost to say, oh, can you give me the revenue by product? Or can you give me the current state of our order backlog? And then it's a very similar situation. You look at it and go, well, what did you actually mean? And then half the time we make it up ourselves. And the other half the time you've got to say, no, listen, I need to ask you, why are you asking? What decision do you want to make on that information? And that's a critical piece here. And there's a great, and this isn't just me saying it, there's a really great article by McKinsey and Harvard Business Review that talk about this. Basically, they're saying organizations have spent an enormous amount of money on, data scientists and all sorts of fancy technologies, and it's not really delivering the goods. And the answer here, they say, is, well, maybe we need a new sort of person involved in the process, like another group of expensive people when we're trying to make stuff, smarter, simpler. Well, that's interesting. But the trouble is, even if you had those people, that depth of business knowledge, it's hard to find. even in subject matter experts within the business. And even if you do find those subject matter experts, they are absolutely like gold dust in operating the business. So they're not going to want to spend a lot of time with finance sort of helping you understand how, what the data means. So this is a really big issue. And I'm not going to go into this, but it's just something that many of you will see, that one of the organizational responses is businesses are saying, well, maybe the answer is we have a chief data officer and they can look after the data problem. They go, yeah, maybe. And this is a great discussion with Tom Davenport, who is probably the father of data thinking, and Sanjay from Genpact. They had this conversation and said that the fact of the matter is that the chief data officers are really challenged because they don't understand enough about the business. And the idea of collecting and organizing data is no longer the problem. It's making sense of it that's the hard part, which is what we're talking about. So, if you're going to have a chief data officer, I mean, basically, the summary of this is that doesn't solve the problem, simply put. You can read what I've written there. So, challenge 5, technology. Technology is the answer, right? Well, is a lovely little quote. First rule of any technology in business is automation applied to efficient operation will magnify it. Brilliant. The problem is if the operation is inefficient, the technology magnifies the inefficiency, and this gets in the way of process. So we got a lot of issues where we got or organizations saying, we're putting these new technologies in, it's going to be great. Now let's have the data out of that. You go, well, hang on a second. You're confusing the picture, because sometimes if you've got bad processes, automation is going to make it worse. And we should be eliminating some stuff rather than complicating it. And simplicity is the ultimate goal. So both in terms of processes and in terms of design, but also in terms of data, how do we make the data we deliver, the insights we deliver for data-driven decision-making, how do we make it simple and accurate? And to be simple, it's really hard. And that's the point that Steve Jobs makes. To be simple is the hardest job in the world, but it's the ultimate sophistication. That's what we have to aim for. And then this whole thing about the technologies, we keep getting told, oh, we're implementing a new cloud ERP, we're implementing SAP's S4HANA, we're going to have a data lake of all this stuff. And everybody will tell you when they've been through this, they say, you know what, we've done all this and we spent tens of millions of dollars. The new problems are still the old problems. We haven't actually fixed the problem. The processes are the same. We've got data in more places than we had before, but nothing's changed. So, if people think that's going to solve the problem, it evidently doesn't. It might solve other problems, but not the core issue. And the final challenge is the time to value and opportunity cost. We've got all of this process. We have to put time in this cycle, this iterative cycle of understanding a business problem, understanding the data, configuring some technology or visualization tool, going around that cycle and getting to a point where it meets the business need. And that time, it takes months or weeks, and we want to be doing it in minutes. So we know elapsed time decays the value delivered. If you wanted any evidence of this, the past 2 years is a great example. So if you had come up with a plan for some great data insights in January 2020 and said, I'll have them for you by May, you know what? It'd have been a waste of time, because guess what? March 2020, the world changed. So we should and that's actually quite healthy for us, because we should always think and realize that the time to deliver anything, whether it's a process change, a technology change, or a data insight, the time to deliver decays the value. So if you think it's got massive value, it's only got massive value if you can deliver it fast. And, doing this, if those of you who are, if you have teams, or if you yourself are trying to create these insights, there's a lot of stuff you got to do. You got to understand what data's there. You got to harmonize that. You got to have rules and algorithms. You got to correlate, understand the anomalies, provide some drill down so people can understand, some visualization. That's easy, right? Supposedly. But you've got so much complexity in the systems you're dealing with. The process variance, the data variance, the application variance, the extensions, the organization structure. It's all of that stuff creates exponential complexity, which is why quite often it takes us far too long to deliver the outcomes we want. So again, we've got to work out how to simplify that. So that is a painful situation. So we did a poll a few months back about what are the big data challenges facing finance. As you can imagine, it was, we did a word map of it all. Gives you a sense of what people, the bigger the word, the bigger most significance. So diversity, the lack of semantic understanding, the business impact, semantics. There's some kind of interesting stuff here. So what I'd ask you is, in your experience, what's the biggest barrier to the effective exploitation of data? Is it one, lack of agreement on what good looks like? What does performance look like? What is number two? Is it getting common business understanding of the data, which we talked about, how many countries in the world? Is it three, the wait for some promised single source of data which will solve all our problems? Is it four, technology debates? Is it five, an insufficiently collaborative culture? Or six, effort and time required for meeting results? And you might have more than one. I doubt you got all of them, but if you took the most significant, one or two of those, if you have a look at those, what's the biggest impact for you in your experience in your organization on the successful exploitation of data to help agility and finance and in the operating units? What do you say to that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? You can have one or two. You could do them all if you want, but it doesn't really help. But I suggest one or two, maybe three in extremis. Let's have a look at the results. So, common understanding of data makes a lot of sense, and the time required. Okay, so that kind of reflects a lot of the discussion, but there's a lot of, there's not a massive difference in all of these. So that's kind of interesting. So thank you for that. Okay, so we'll spin on. I said I'd talk for 40 minutes, and I've talked for 40 minutes already. So I'm going to try and come through on some of these, get to the conclusion here. Right, let me move on. So how do we crack this data-driven decision-making problem? One of the things is, and one thing I've kind of focused on a lot is, whatever tools you have, it's very easy that you think the tool you have applies for everything. So when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? You've heard that quote before. But I think it's worth remembering, like, are we using the right tools for the job here? And the biggest tool for the job is, both the IQ to understand things and the EQ to engage with the stakeholders. Now, you also hear a lot of, well, that's all these problems are understandable, Dan, but, AI is going to solve the problem, right? And I'm not going to go into this in any detail other than to say, a great man once said that the greatest example of foolishness is try to AI your way out of a problem you don't understand. So if you don't understand the process, you don't understand the data, forget the AI. That's because that is predicated on those two things. There's a bunch of other issues. The bit I find funny is AI-driven image recognition can't tell the difference between a labradoodle and a chicken nugget at the moment. So it gives you some sense of some of the challenges we have. I mean, there's a lot of good applications of AI. I'm just using that for a little bit of light humor. But what I'm saying is, if you don't understand the problem, don't understand the data, don't expect AI to solve it for you. So how are we going to fix these big problems? So expectations receive wisdom. We've got to stay alert to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Be aware of it and make sure you socialize that massively within your community. So nobody is jumping to conclusions because everyone says it's obvious. Don't allow everyone to just go down the it's obvious route. Deep business process knowledge. We've got to identify and tap into real business subject matter experts, but they're not always who you think they are. So you've got to find the real ones, not the ones who are advertised. Performance versus defects. You want people and you want to encourage your leadership to say, focus on the red, ignore the green, show me the red and let's dig into that. And that will help us drive performance improvement. If you're just saying that I drove 42 miles an hour on the road for the past hour, it doesn't really help me. What I want to know is what I'm going to be doing in the future. Hidden meaning in data, dig deep into data semantics. We talked about how many countries in the world. That's exactly that example. Technology and digital business, just maintain a healthy skepticism. A number of people I talk to say, oh, we're not doing anything because we're waiting for the next big thing. And in 2 years' time, our next big thing will be here. And you go, really? That's the business has got to keep progressing for the next 2 years while you wait for that. And then time to value and opportunity cost. What I'd suggest is think about the Pareto principle and a 4-quadrant idea I'm going to share with you. So Pareto thinking is this. In business, we have this idea of these kind of big initiatives, these red line initiatives, strategic initiatives where we sink cost in And we hope that in 6 or 9 months, we're going to deliver value, but normally it's 2 to 3 years before we start seeing our return coming over the line. Pareto principle is about delivering value where you deliver 80% of the outcome for 20% or less of the value of the cost, effort, or cycle time. And it's critically important, not just because you do things quicker, but you also miss them. You benefit from missing out on the big discontinuities like we had in the past 2 years. You drive incremental value, experience-informed strategy, you make sure you're on the right line, and the business gets ready for change on a regular basis. So Pareto, if you start delivering business insights short and sharp regularly, you'll have a massively more positive outcome than waiting for some big strategic red line initiative to deliver all the business insights you think the business might want, and they'll get them in 2 years or 18 months or even 12 months. Here's another thing that interests me about data and processes. You know, even this day, we're in 2022, we're still doing this stuff by building brick walls with mortar and cement. And when people just want an office to go to, they don't really care about the walls. But we've got smart ways of putting more bricks together more quickly. We can do 5 bricks at a time. We've got automated bricklayers, but actually that's not really the point. What we want is the answer. So we've got to think about that really carefully. And I think as an industry, as finance executives, got to think through this. Is there a better way? And I think we should think more about data-driven decision-making in the 4 quadrants. Think about it. What's the strategic advantage in the context we're looking at? So if we're looking at a business activity or business decision, business process, which has strategic advantage to our organization, and time and cost is not sensitive, so we've got plenty of time and we can spend, then we should build it ourselves. If time and cost sensitive is there, we should partner. But if it's stuff that isn't strategic advantage, it's about the operational processes, I think we're entering an era where we can buy or rent those things, and that business process expertise will be embedded. So here's an example. You know, top left, core strategic priorities, some examples there where you might say, I don't want to partner with that. I've got time to do it. I want to make sure it's specific to us. Top right, some of those things you might say, yeah, they're strategically important, but I can afford to partner on them. And bottom right, I think there's some core financial processes maybe, which are largely 80% common across organizations. So thoughts of the road, it's peeling an onion. It ain't simple. And we are making a lot of progress, but not as much progress as is being led to believe by these kind of the wonders of information is beautiful. You got to remember Dunning-Kruger. I remember the simple answers and the complex answers. My view is, and this is Frank Zappa, I didn't realize he was a philosopher, but he said, without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. So we've got to think about what can we do differently to what we've done before, rather than just keep doing the same thing and expect different results, because that's the definition of madness, right? So I think there is a data-driven decision-making playbook for finance. It's based on these 6 issues. And if I were to suggest one thing to you, dig into those 6 topics and work out how can you socialize and develop your strategy, your playbook to make those things happen. And you know what? None of it is about the technology you're using. That's the irony of it. Yeah, the technologies are great, but they don't solve those problems. So we've got to accelerate innovation. That's what we talked about. And I've spent an additional 5 minutes talking. I should have done. So let's have some questions.
No worries, Dan, at all. We were getting lots of great comments coming in our chat. I want to bring one to your attention from Brad. So he made a comment that there's trouble in that the business experts are too busy trying to make this month's, this quarter's, this year's targets to contribute to meaningful data management projects. And when they do become available, they may not have the data savvy needed. So is there something that Brad could do or people could do if they find themselves in that situation to where they're either too busy or don't have the savvy that they need?
That's a great point, Brad. And the good news is you found the real experts, because the fact they're not available tells you they are the experts. You want to worry when you ask for a subject matter expert and they're immediately available. You think, hang on, what's that about? So the good news is you found the right people by evidence. The challenge is, as I mentioned earlier, these folks they're like gold dust in the business operations. So my suggestion is twofold. There's 2 bits of subject matter expertise you want: the business process subject matter expertise and the data subject matter expertise. Now, the data one is a bit more complicated because it's a bit of business and a bit of sort of database kind of stuff. But let's say you found the business subject matter experts. My suggestion is to find ways of building a rapport with those people outside any specific initiative, trying to get to know them, trying to ask them little questions, trying to get little bits of their time, because you will never get, unless there's some critical life or death thing for the business, which there rarely is, you will never get them to allocate time as into a project. So you've got to find a way of winning hearts and minds so they want to give you a bit of their time at the end of each day. And that's my suggestion, because the reality is, half an hour of a real subject matter expert is worth a week of somebody who isn't. So I agree it's a challenge, but once you build that rapport, you will find those subject matter experts are feeding you with expertise, and then you tell them about some of the success that you've had. They will feel good about that, and they'll kind of be your partners in crime, and you'll find they'll want to give you more time. Eventually, they will say to their own leadership, I should be spending more time on this data stuff. It has a massive impact for us. So I'm suggesting you do the kind of the road less traveled. Just try and find who the people are. Try and build a bit of a relationship. Can I just have 10 minutes of your time? I just need your advice on something. And then that 10 minutes becomes 15 minutes. And then can I get half an hour of you next week? Can I, whatever. Can I buy you a coffee?
Before we get to the next question, Dan, Brad wanted to clarify that you, when you say gold dust, that you mean that they have both the understanding of how the business influences data and how the data influences the business, that they need to understand those.
Yes, and also they understand that they are highly valued by their business operations because they're good at process execution. They're good at running the business as well, and that's what you want. You don't want people with a kind of an academic understanding. You want people with a practical understanding of what really happens. So yeah, the gold dust is business process. They'll understand a bit about the data. They might not understand the technical data implementation. That doesn't matter so much, but they will understand about what changes happen in sales orders between distribution and direct sales. And they'll know that stuff, and that's what you want to know.
All right, next question. Would you recommend beginning this with devising an overall organizational data strategy?
That's an interesting point. If you had all the time in the world, that'd be a wonderful thing to do. The problem is we never have all the time in the world. So I would definitely advise you to get some kind of data model, data map of the data that supports the process you're focused. So let's say you're focused on revenue for the sake of argument. A rough high-level data model. People call this subject areas. What are the key things? We've got markets, customers, products, services. These things, how do they relate to each other? And use that to guide your conversations with the subject matter experts and use it to refine it. Personally, I think the risk of trying to do a full data architecture for an organization, you're going to be doing that for a year, and there's no demonstrable business outcome other than you understand more than you understood before.
Sonia, to answer your question quickly, we'll also type it back. But yes, a copy of the video recording and slides will be sent to everyone who registered within 2 business days. So yes, everyone will be getting a copy and also posted in the APQC resource library. I have another question coming in. I know we're getting close to time. But Julie says, in a project like this, I'm not sure what she was referring to, that takes years, I have found that companies experience organizational add and want to move on to the next thing. The CEO saw in a United Airlines magazine. How do we overcome this with senior leadership at budget time?
Right, that's a great question, Julie. So it's all about Pareto principle. We have to, it is true that executive attention is like goldfish attention. You got, as soon as you've lost it, they've forgotten everything, right? So, but the reality is, if you focus on how can I deliver value in a very short period of time, so 80% of what's needed for 20% or less of the effort, cost, and cycle time, they won't have time to look at the American Airlines in-flight magazine because you'll be delivering stuff to them. But that's a challenge. So you need to have that kind of Pareto principle picture, and how can I scope the problem so I can give them some value because all that stuff they see in the magazine takes ages to deliver. So deliver small bits of Pareto principle and get them on the road, and then people understand that. Executive understands iterative progress.
Beautiful. I think I've hit everyone's questions today. Thank you so much for attending. We want to make sure that everyone knows how to contact Dan, so this will be included also in your slides. So we've got his email address and his LinkedIn. Please feel free to follow and connect with him. He shares some really valuable insight all the time. And Dan and I always have some really interesting conversations too. So make sure to subscribe to our podcast to hear what Dan has to say. And also make sure and check out our future webinars and webinars on demand at apqc.org/events, and register for some new and upcoming webinars that we have across all function areas. And we recently just announced our 2023 APQC conference for the week of April 17th through 21st. So feel free to learn more about that coming up next year. So thank you everyone for attending today, and Dan for presenting on data management. And wow, what's some great ways to kind of help us overcome these challenges today. This is really useful information. And our attendees today, when you exit our webinar, please feel free to take the survey at the end and let us know what you thought about. Oh, everyone, you're welcome. Thank you for coming. Feel free to take the survey today. Let us know how we did, and make sure that we can improve our process. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.